speed with which Lenin wins support for the April theses is a reflection of this extraordinary charisma and authority that he commands. And he doesn't do that, you know, through manipulation or through coercion. This is something that he commands as a result of his long political career.
Stephen, you know, obviously there were political tensions. There were also tensions of another character, that a lot of the committee men inside Russia, who had carried on, you know, at great sort of cost to themselves and very courageously kept the party going in bad times. There was all, they would never say that about Lenin, of course, but there was a general resentment against the ones who were in exile. You always have that in movements, you know, historically. They're the exiles, we are the ones who are fighting, and it's usually an argument used when they can't reply politically. Yes. But it is an argument that comes up, and I'm sure some of that, which of course we know later Stalin played on like anything, was an important part of it. But he won the party round. And once he'd won, once the revolution was won, then of course, how could they deny
Indeed.
that what he'd done was right? So would it be accurate? I mean, my own feeling, I mean, I know it creates a sort of nervousness on the left, is that, you know, it's something which I don't think you can say about other revolutions. I mean, if Cromwell had not existed, the English Revolution, as we know it, would have happened. If Robespierre had not existed, there was Danton, there were others, the French Revolution would have happened. I can't say that about Russia. I don't mean the February Revolution, obviously. I mean, I don't think without Lenin there would have been a socialist revolution in Russia.
I agree with you. I mean, Trotsky obviously is the second leader of the revolution, but Trotsky doesn't operate in quite the way Lenin does. And Trotsky remains, you know, a rather uncomfortable figure within the Bolshevik party.
Always.
Lenin was back for a few months in late 1905 into 1906, but otherwise he had been out of Russia for almost 17 years, really.
And had no idea. I mean, the last public speech he gave in Switzerland before boarding the train told young Swiss socialists, you know, your generation is lucky, it will see the revolution. This is a privilege. Our generation is not going to.
Yes, indeed.
And then February breaks. So it is quite an amazing in this, you know, one could sort of proceed further. The same can be said about the Chinese and Vietnamese upheavals, that if Mao Ho Chi Minh, someone else would have taken over, in fact, it might have been better in one or two cases, but, you know, or the Cubans. You cannot say that in the case of the Russian Revolution. Okay, so we are now in a situation where Lenin is back. The April theses saying that we have to now go forward and make a socialist, anti-capitalist revolution lays the basis for the century of an anti-capitalist politics. That's the other big achievement. And then we have this period from February to October. Are they going to succeed? Are they not going to succeed? What are the enemies going to do? And almost in the middle, from February to October, we have the July days, where the right come back, Lenin flees the country, Trotsky is arrested, Bolshevik leaders are imprisoned, and they think we've pulled it off again. Could you explain the July days, Stephen? What exactly happened in that period, in July 1917?
Well, we have to remember that the July days took place at a time when a new offensive was taking place on the Eastern Front. So Kerensky had got his way with some difficulty, but he too was a man, a great speaker, a demagogue in many respects, a very theatrical character, but by touring the fronts, he was able to get enough units to go onto the offensive in Galicia, so southwestern parts of the empire. And this caused enormous consternation in Petrograd among the soldiers who knew that they would soon be removed from the capital and put into battle. So this was one context. The other was, however, the growing feeling that the Soviet leadership was now in cahoots with the capitalists and landlords of the provisional government, that they had ceased to represent workers and soldiers in the way they were supposed to do. Their very name was Soviet of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies. The feeling was they must go out onto the streets. They had done this actually in April, again in protest against the war policy of the provisional government. But things had been building up steadily, and a crisis was there. The very small trigger was that, paradoxically, something often forgotten, the right wing too was despairing of coalition with the Petrograd Soviet, and so the cadet ministers resigned from the government on the 1st of July over a technicality. They've been thinking about this for a long time. They hope that this will put pressure on Kerensky to remove the socialists who are now in the government. For those on the streets, the hope is to create an all-socialist government based on the Soviets. There's much discussion among historians as to how far the Bolsheviks were behind the events on the streets of 3rd to the 5th of July 1917. I think it's pretty clear that actually this is a movement that wells up pretty spontaneously among machine gunners and among workers. But there are historians who'd say this was all plotted by Lenin. The attempt to force the leadership of the Petrograd Soviet to take power, in other words, to say, okay, the liberals have left the government, we can now declare ourselves a government of Russia. They refused to do this and were able to bring in troops. So this is a kind of moment when you see that Petrograd is not the whole of Russia. They're able to bring in troops from outside who restore order in a fairly brutal way. Kerensky seizes on this moment in order to try to suppress the Bolshevik party, so the printing presses of the party are raided, warrants for the arrest of the major leaders are put out, and as you say, Lenin goes into hiding in Finland eventually, not immediately. So this is a kind of critical moment. It's also a moment that links back to what you were talking about in relation to the train, the sealed train on which the Lenin and other leaders came into Russia.
They say they're German agents.
They say they're German agents. We have proof, they say, that they've been in receipt of German gold. And this actually, for a time, has considerable impact on public opinion. We're talking revolution here, so enormous amounts of things happen in a very compressed space of time. But for a few weeks, the Bolsheviks are very, very much on the defensive. They nevertheless hold their 6th Party Congress in this period. But the sense on Lenin's part is that the clock is ticking and very little is happening. And so from September, so for several weeks, as I say, there's a kind of quiet period when the Bolsheviks are searching around as to what to do. For example, they dropped the slogan, "All power to the Soviets." This has been a kind of setback for them. They're thinking, how do we move forward politically? But from the end of September, Lenin is absolutely confident that things are going in their direction. And a crucial event here, which I think is decisive in swinging the majority of workers and soldiers away from the moderates, with whom they're very, very disillusioned. But a real break in the popular mood takes place when Kerensky and General Kornilov come together to effectively establish a military dictatorship. They fall out because Kerensky wants to remain prime minister, whereas Kornilov has contempt for him as a sort of noisy but empty politician. Kornilov then takes steps to bring troops to the capital, to Petrograd, to oust certainly the Soviet, maybe the government, we're not so sure, but effectively to set up some kind of military dictatorship. And this is the beginning of the white movement, I would argue. I mean, people always sort of see the whites as emerging in 1918, but this is a counter-revolutionary movement. And, you know, behind it, there are bankers and industrialists who finance these things. They're very, very poorly organized. As it were, the literal counter-revolutionary organizations are very fragmented. They're very much in dispute with one another. But nevertheless, this is the moment when ordinary people see that effectively they're in a situation where the hopes of February for some kind of free Russia are dispelled, and the alternatives are now likely to be either some kind of military dictatorship or some kind of all-Soviet power.
So, in the meantime, the Soviets have agreed, and everyone seems to have agreed, that elections to a constituent assembly should take place. And, you know, in the preceding months, it was agreed that this assembly, elected by all the people of Russia, would determine the new constitution, etc. And strangely, despite this revolutionary ferment, these elections do take place. And they end on the very eve of the seizure of power.
Just after, actually. Yeah.
Just after the seizure of power. And the vote, I mean, is quite revealing, but not at all surprising. The Social Revolutionaries, the big peasant party in Russia, has the largest vote, 12 or 13 million. And the Bolsheviks, you know, this especially for those who say we're a tiny minority, have 10 million votes. So 10 million have voted, mainly workers in factories, but not just them. So the division is between these two. And I mean, it's another question of, you know, debate whether or not they should have disbanded the assembly. I mean, the Bolsheviks said they couldn't be bothered with it. You know, there were more important things to do. The counter-revolution was there. The Entente powers were plotting. There was interventions in Russia by foreign armies, and to make this Constituent Assembly the central thing. But that debate continues, doesn't it?
I think, if anything, recent work on the Constituent Assembly, which is in Soviet times, it was pretty much a taboo topic. But I mean, it shows the extraordinary elaborateness of the plans for the Constituent Assembly. This really was something that was intended to involve the remotest corners of the empire. Lenin, pretty much a kind of realist, felt that there was nothing to be achieved by letting the Constituent Assembly go ahead. But there were many in the party who disagreed
with that.
There were those who felt that there was nothing intrinsically impossible in bringing a Soviet and some kind of parliamentary regime together. As you say, there were all these contextual factors. This was a regime which was fighting for its life. Rightly or wrongly, you know, whether you support it or not, it is a fact that the seizure of power was challenged from the first. There were, by the time the Constituent Assembly met, there was an army gathering in South Russia, in the Don region, around the Cossacks. So this was, you know, a time when I mean, personally, I don't think the Constituent Assembly should have been suppressed, but I entirely understand that for very, very real political reasons.
Why they had to do it.
Why they did it. And so, in some ways, what's more remarkable is now, I think, is that given the enormous energy that went into, you know, organising voting booths for little settlements in the mountains of the northern Caucasus, that actually the response to the closure was extremely limited.
I was just going to say that.
And the reason is, I think, that the big issue for the peasants had been resolved by this stage, and it was two things. Land was now passing into the hands of the peasants, and the second thing was the Bolsheviks had issued a decree on peace, and the army was rapidly disintegrating. So the two key driving forces, at least for the peasantry in 1917, had been resolved. And again, I would argue that Soviet power was very popular with peasants. Although I've talked primarily about the cities, and the Soviets were urban institutions in origin. Nevertheless, the idea of devolving power to the very lowest levels meant that through the winter of 1917, 1918, a lot of peasant communes, local community organizations declared themselves to be Soviets of peasant deputies, not necessarily supportive of the Bolsheviks, but supportive
Soviets.
of the abstract idea of Soviet power. So I think there was something to what Lenin is saying, in the sense that Soviet power was the wave of the future, and all the expectations through 1917 had been for some kind of parliamentary democracy which would genuinely be representative of the people. In some ways that receded all the time, because revolutions drive forward with, remarkable speed, and so what was politically necessary or reasonable 1 month ago ceases to be, a month or 2 months subsequently. This is kind of the dynamic of revolution. It's very hard, I think, for people, again, in the West, where politics is such a kind of, grimly kind of predictable business, in which the contours and the boundaries of politics are so much a given, taken for granted, to understand that revolutionary politics is just not like that.
It's very fluid.
It's very fluid. Yes.
And this is also the case with the English Revolution, which is never taught properly in this country. It was very fluid.
Yes, indeed.
Likewise, the French Revolution. So, Stephen, we have now a situation where they're in power, the Bolsheviks. They become incredibly, as they say openly, there's no pretense, this is a revolutionary dictatorship, yes? Because we need this dictatorship in order to save the country against all the powers assembling around, and keep the situation moving forward. But it's a temporary phase. Lenin said at a key point, why is it temporary? Because with the German Revolution and the spread to Europe, the situation will be very different. And that too is very difficult for people to understand today, that the situation in Germany after 1918 was very fluid. And it was, one can argue this, but it was a case. Rosa Luxemburg certainly felt that the insurrection in Berlin was mistimed. A bad misjudgment, but naturally she went along with it because that was the decision of her comrades. The other side, including Karl Liebknecht and others, said that they were pushing us and pushing us and pushing us by hard repression, that the only way we could defend ourselves was by an insurrection. And of course, we will never know. Who knows? What would have happened had they not gone for the insurrection? It's not totally impossible that they would have been wiped out anyway, because the Russian Revolution had now created this sense of fear all over the European ruling classes and amongst moderate socialist parties, that this was evil that had to be wiped out. And that partially explains what happened in Germany. Without the support of the German Social Democratic Party, it's impossible for them to have wiped out the German Revolution.
No, absolutely. I'm personally a bit skeptical as to whether there could have been a proletarian revolution in Germany for two reasons. I think one is that What you have extraordinarily in Russia is a revolutionary peasantry. The peasantry in the rest of Europe had kind of gradually kind of moved to the right. And you have a very, very powerful bourgeoisie that is well-financed in Germany. By contrast, the bourgeoisie in Russia is relatively weak. I mean, it is not able, say, in the course of 1917, really to coordinate a response to the rise of factory committees, demands for workers' control and so on. I mean, the power is, the government obviously is on the side of those people, but the government has kind of lost real ability to restore order, let's say, which would have meant, a violent restoration of order in factories, in the countryside and so on. So I think there are differences between Germany, but expanding more positively in the sense, in the direction you're going, I think we underestimate the extent to which the fact of revolution in this empire already is completely destabilizing. You have, attempts to create nation states. Poland, notably, you have the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you have the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And the crisis in the German Empire is one more and one very important element. But from Eastern through into Central Europe, you have this deeply destabilized situation after really from the time of the Bolshevik seizure of power. And as you say, it creates a great counter-reaction, a great fear. But the depth of that crisis, I think, is the potential for revolution, I think, is very deep. So you see it in Hungary, you see it, in Bavaria, you've got little sort of revolutions in Italy, a bit later. But so there is a kind of revolutionary situation across Europe. Going back to our point, if we do concede the importance of revolutionary leadership, then the sort of abject kind of role of the German Social Democrats has to become a kind of big part of an explanation. But as I say, I'm fundamentally a social historian, so I kind of think about politics in the context of social and economic forces. And to me, the constellation of forces in Germany is rather different from that in Russia. If anything, I would look to the east. I would be more optimistic about the possibilities of revolution in Persia or in India or in China.
Well, interestingly enough, after the failure of the European revolutions to mature, or their defeats, which is what happened in the wiping out of the most radical leaders in some of these countries, they did start thinking like that. Yes, there are exchanges between Lenin and Trotsky, and Lenin says, well, okay, we can't wait. Let's try and destroy the British Empire. Let's try and see how we can help the Indians. Let's see what we can do in China, etc., etc. So it's not that they stopped, which is why this sort of slightly slanderous allegation that they were Eurocentric is actually not true.
It's absolutely not true. And I think, I talked about the sort of blinders on us looking at the revolution 100 years on, but I mean, in some ways we are more attuned to the sort of global implications of capitalism, certainly. And I think the Bolsheviks were quite extraordinary in their understanding of the power of anti-imperialism in the colonial world, the importance of issues like race. 1919 is the opening of the third Communist International, the first Communist Congress. It happens to be also the year when the first League in the United States for the Advancement of Colored People also has a Congress. But if you look at its demands compared with those of the Bolsheviks, I think they are very, very limited. They are essentially, about some legal reforms. By contrast, the Bolsheviks have thought about the revolution on a global scale and are very, very attuned to the interrelationship of class struggle in the West, to the struggles of colonized peoples for liberation.
They organized conferences, the Toilers of the East conference that was held, the Far Eastern Peoples Conference that was held. I mean, for the early years of the 20th century, this is astonishing.
Also, one of the perspectives that I stress now, probably in a way I didn't do before, is to think about this as a revolution in an empire. And so, we think about it as a Russian Revolution, but the implications of this for peoples in Central Asia or in the Caucasus are enormous. And one of the things about the Russian Revolution is that it is a revolution against empire. It's a revolution in which different groups, formerly within the Russian Empire, but also outside, are fighting for some kind of national self-determination. Again, that's a project that becomes more and more radical, but the anti-imperialism of the Bolsheviks increasingly appeals to key constituencies. So although nationalist movements within the former empire are quite divided, in the end, those that seek to oppose the Bolsheviks are forced to do deals with either the Allies or with Germany. They're too weak without the backing of some strong external power. And for many, the Bolshevik option becomes the most attractive. It may not be perfect, but it offers them the chance for national self-determination, for nation building, for extension of culture and language and so on. And increasingly, once the Soviet Union starts to form from 1922, the option for some kind of territorially based sub-state within the Soviet Union. And I don't slight that. I mean, there are lots and lots of people who say, well, this was just another version of empire. This was just... But it may have become that under Stalin, but through the 1920s, there's extraordinary efflorescence of nation building.
I remember meeting many years ago in North London an Armenian carpet merchant. And we were just chatting because I was looking at the carpets in his shop. And I said, how are things with you generally on a world scale? He said the only place where we Armenians really feel happy is Soviet Armenia. Just like that. Yeah. And he wasn't even political.
No.
But it was just a statement of fact that that's where we feel no one can hurt us anymore.
Indeed.
And it's given us something. So I think all that shouldn't be underestimated at all. One last question, Stephen, is this. What do you think? I know it's difficult, we don't know. When will the Russians themselves begin to take an interest in their revolution again, if ever?
It's a really interesting question. I think I have been of the view for most of last year that they didn't have to celebrate it. I mean, there is a kind of view these days that an anniversary comes along and you have to kind of do something. I think the signs are there's going to be very little. I heard from somebody who is very high in the Academy of Sciences in Russia that 2 years ago the historian section was told that it should think about this, but if they were going to promote it in some sort of way, it had to be around the idea of the Bolsheviks as recreators of a Russian state. It's a sort of interesting kind of reflection of Putin's own sort. And that hasn't been happening. And so I think there will be, the church, of course, will mark it in its own sort of way. But I think there are not going to be any kind of credible narratives that would allow the Putin regime to appropriate the revolution in the way it is sometimes expected to.
The only thing they can incorporate is Stalin.
Yeah.
Which they have done to a certain extent. He's hardly ever criticized. And that, they say, is because of the war. Whether you like it or not, he was our leader during the war, and we won the war. But beyond that, they don't go. No. And I mean, I hope one of these days some young layer will realize that actually Lenin's a better bet than Prince Stolypin.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Stephen, thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
It's been
Yes,
lovely
it's very
talking to
enjoyable.
you.
Yes, thank you.